Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Art Forum SF, co-sponsored by the South Asian departments of UC Santa Cruz, Berkeley, and Stanford University, we welcome you all to Sala 2023. Sure. The topic for this session is Triumph of a Woman, with our guest speakers Shikha Malviya and Ava Homa, who are in conversation with Sandhya Gujjar. Just a brief intro bio about Shikha and our speakers. Shikha Malviya is an Indian-American poet, writer, and publisher. She's co-founder of the Great Indian Poetry Collective, a mentorship model press publishing powerful voices from India and the Indian diaspora. Her poetry has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and featured in Catamaran, Plume, Prairie, Schooner, and other fine publications. Shikha has been featured TEDx speaker and was selected as Poet Laureate of San Ramon, California. Ava Homa is an award-winning author and activist. Her novel, Daughters of Smoke and Fire, was a Roxanne Gay Book Club selection, won the 2020 Silver Nautilus Award, and was a finalist for the 2022 William Saroyan Prize. Her book of short stories, Echoes from the Otherland, was nominated for the 2011 Frank O'Connor Short Story Prize. Holding a master's degree in creative writing, her work has been featured in publications including The Globe and Mail, BBC, Toronto Star, and Literary Hub. She's also a 2023 recipient of the California Arts Council Fellowship. And with that, on to Sandhya Gujjar to host the session. Thank you.
Thank you. So welcome back, friends, after that lovely talk we had just now, and which also talked about displacement and the empowerment of women. Before I start the session today, I would like all of us to applaud the Nobel Prize jury's decision to award the 2023 Nobel Peace Prize to jailed Iranian human rights activist Narges Mohammadi for her fight against the oppression of women in Iran, as well as promoting human rights and freedom for all. The jury said that the Iranian government has arrested Mohammadi 13 times, convicted her 5 times, and sentenced her to a total of 31 years in prison and 154 lashes. How important this is when we are now beginning this session, which is Triumph of a Woman. And I have 2 triumphant women with me here, Ava Homa, who is a novelist and a Kurd from the Iranian side of Kurdistan, or what was formerly Kurdistan, and Shikha Malviya, the poet, and both talk of triumphant women in their works. Let me assure you that both these ladies are actually much larger than the data which was just read out by the volunteer here, and the characters they write about are even more gigantic. Shikha's book, Anandibai Joshi, A Life in Poems, is an unusual and challenging foray into difficult terrain, putting oneself inside the skin and bones and heart and mind of a real woman who lived 150 years back and narrating her almost impossible to believe story through poems. When asked, if not yourself, whom would you like to be? Anandibai answered, no one. It takes not just confidence, but a tremendous sense of self-belief to be able to make that kind of a comeback answer without batting an eyelid. Ava Homa's book, Daughters of Smoke and Fire, is a haunting piece of political fiction and a gut-punch trail of an alienated Kurdish girl, Leila Saman, swimming upstream against the tide of sexism and ethnic hatred. The scars Homa herself bears as a Kurdish feminist reared under Iranian rule, and now living in the cruelty of exile in this country are evident on every page. This is the second book by the Kurdish author in English, and that certainly calls for a round of applause. At the end of the book, Leela Saman, having fulfilled her dream of becoming a filmmaker, is being feted as she is nominated for Best Director at the Caen Film Festival. In a TV interview, she is asked, "How do you feel about being a Kurd? Are you proud?" She answers, "Proud is not the right word, but I'm happy to be one. It was awfully tough and took a while, a long while, but I learned to appreciate being a human, a woman, and a Kurd." A tear streaked down her father's face, watching her on TV from his home in Halabja city in Iran, the daughter he had disowned many years back. He didn't reach out to dry that tear. Instead, he composed his first email with the subject line, "My daughter." So, I applaud Sala for including a brilliant author from the Middle East, or it is SWANA, isn't it? It is SWANA, that is the new form of Middle East, and it stands for? Southwest Asia and North America. So we should all learn to not call it Middle East, but to call it SWANA. So I applaud Sala for including her for the first time in this event. And believe me, this is truly changing the narrative, if that is the theme of this event. I expect the coming years will offer platforms to even more creative voices from different parts of Asia. So I'll now sit down and ask questions to Awa first, and then to Shikha. Then I'll put in some concluding sentences, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Is that fine? Great. So Awa, you received very positive reviews for your novel, Daughters of Smoke and Fire. Roxane Gay, the influential literary critic, chose your novel for her book club, calling it beautifully written, intelligent, and powerful. A story of slowly building self-liberation and resilience. For those who haven't had the chance to read Daughters of Smoke and Fire, can you give a brief overview? Here you go.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, everyone, for being here despite the heat. It's lovely to look at your faces. And thanks to Sala for bringing us together and making this happen. Okay. I thought I have a teacher's voice. Looks like I don't. So Daughters of Smoke and Fire is the story of Layla, a Kurdish Iranian woman who is very much influenced by her father's activism and imprisonment. And her dream is to rely on art to tell the stories of her people. Her brother, Chia, a few years younger than Layla, is interested in becoming a human rights lawyer and taking the perpetrators to International Criminal Court. One day, he takes part in a protest in Iran, which are uncommon in that country, and he disappears. It falls upon Layla to find out where he is and if she can help him. So she starts publishing his writings online, and that puts her own life in danger. In the meantime, Chia's friend approaches her and has a very scammy offer. He says that, "I can take you to safety of Canada if you marry me on paper." It looks like a good offer, at least she would be safe, but she can't really trust this guy because she suspects he played a role in her brother's disappearance. And Layla is a woman growing up in Iran, so obviously you know what that means. That's, as she mentioned, streaming out against gender oppression, but Layla is also Kurdish. And for those of you who say, I've heard that word before, but I don't exactly remember what it is, Kurds are people, basically, they're descendants of the Medes, for those of you who are into history, and they settled in the Zagros area mountains 300 years before the birth of Christ, and have lived there as part of the Persian Empire and Ottoman Empire. And you might have heard the Kurds in the news a couple of years ago, Kurdish female fighters who were fighting against ISIS, right? And the Western world were so shocked by it because they have this limited stereotypical visions of the Eastern world in general. And they were like, where do these women come from? Well, they didn't come from nowhere. Back in when Kurdistan was on the map, 15th and 16th century Western travel writers have reported and documented that Kurdish women were rulers and governors when this was not heard of in their areas between their neighbors. And so Kurds back then, because it was impossible for empires to extend their rule everywhere, they would allow people to be ruled by their own people. After the First World War, the Allies decided to redraw the map of the area in their own interests. So in 1923, they signed the Treaty of Sevres, and they promised the Kurds their own land. The Brits wanted a biggest share of the region. The French wanted what's today's Syria. And so they decided that, Kurds aren't particularly docile. They sit on oil. They have a lot of water. We don't want to give them their own country. So they started creating the country of Iraq, and they completely redrew the map. All the ethnic groups in the area got their own country. And that part of the world, Swana, we don't use the word Middle East because it's so laden with negative connotation that it basically stops the conversation. It really dehumanizes that part of the world. So they looked at Swana and they decided that Kurds aren't supposed to have their own land, their own country. Well, we were living on our land, but one day they cut our land into 4 pieces, and suddenly your grandma was in this country. You guys are familiar with partition. Now, your grandma was part of Turkey, and your cousin was part of Syria, and your dad's finally from Iran, and you're part of Iraq, and you're like, what happened? And that being erased from the map, which is a very powerful poetic imagery, is also really the beginning of a lot of suffering and what the Kurds have gone through in terms of really horrendous things like genocide and ethnocide, which is killing the ethnicity, taking away your right to know your mother language or speak in it. And that's basically a brief history of the Kurds. And what I wanted to add is, for Kurds, it's very important to not be defined by oppression and instead being defined by resistance. And that's why the most common mantra in Kurdistan is Bar Khudan Jiana, resistance is life, resistance is life. And that's the theme of Layla as she struggles with everything that comes her way.
Thank you, Awa. So the Independent in the UK also picked Daughters as one of the top books of the year, praising it as a blisteringly powerful tale of standing up to oppression. So can you speak a bit about the importance of literature like Daughters of the Smoke and Fire to give voice to minority group like the Kurds, and how it might help people become better informed on the realities of the situation on the ground?
Thank you. I'll be brief with that one. So I know we all do have this heartfelt desire to get to know each other better, and then politics and media not only doesn't facilitate that, in fact stops that by offering one-dimensional views and distorted images. And it's the role of literature, witness literature, like Daughters of Smoke and Fire, to give you what media leaves out, right? If you're wondering, why should another Iranian woman win the Nobel Prize while she is in prison? What would make her continue protesting despite having been taken to prison 10 times, 13 times, right? The answer is in literature like this. So I feel like I understand the rest of the world through literature, and I hope my book gives you a glimpse of what it's like to be in that part of the world. And I hope it's not just what's it like to be there, but really to see your own humanity and your own strength reflected back at you. Can I read one page?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Just so you can get a sense of style.
Yeah. Actually, that is what I think Dr. Abraham Verghese just said about fiction, isn't it? That once you write fiction, you create the reality in a much more stronger manner in the minds of the people rather than what they see on television.
Yes, exactly. He said it's the biggest lie that tells you the biggest truth about life. So I'm reading the prologue. A woman alone on the mountain at dusk. An invisible boot pressed against my throat, making my breath labored and helpless. And yet I couldn't go back and face my parents or my stifled future. Hidden behind a boulder, I hugged my knees and imagined my rage and pain whirling into a wildfire, burning down all the injustices. Could my father have known what was going on? I wanted to tell him, to share this burden with him. My shoulders were already heavy beneath the daily cruelties of living as a woman in La'natawa, the damn place. This fatigue was incurable. The sun had suntered down, disappeared behind Lake Srebar. A dozen shades of red burst open along the horizon. Below, the narrow, winding asphalt road was the hem around the hill's green skirt, embroidered with clusters of red and yellow wildflowers. The Schleer flowers stood elegant, and that's the flower that's on the cover of the book. The Schleer flowers stood elegant and tall, flourishing across the rough Kurdistan plateau, defying borders. I yearned to be a flower, but I was a garden of anguish, of loathing, of torment. My occupied homeland was a birthplace of death. I stood up, my breath now coming in pants. I wasn't hiding anymore. Bessa, Bess, I shouted, it's enough, enough. I started down the hill in a tumbling run and found myself unable to stop. Despite the chill of the evening, I started sweating. The wind whipped my headscarf and I gained speed. I flapped as if I had wings. As I ran, a wail escaped my chest. I was headed toward the main road, toward the world of men. The streets belonged to them, these judgmental men, hypocritical men, their honor dependent on women, men. Cars hurtled around the curve full of drunk drivers who honked as they spotted me springing down the hillside. They were going too fast for this road, too fast for their sluggish reflexes, and too fast for their old vehicles. A white, late-model car careened down the winding road, kicking up dust. The wind roared in my ears. The white car and whoever was driving it seemed to seek me out as a fellow traveler. I stumbled on a stone, crushing the shiny red poppies in the grass, and as I lurched, my untold stories tumbled inside me like pages ripped from a book and tossed, crumpled into the waste paper bin. An overpowering urge to scream my story, to expel it from beginning to end, seized me. Descending the slope at a breakneck pace, my shouts crescendoing, I was unable to stop myself, this crazed woman. A final lunge, and I was airborne. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful, wasn't it? It tells the story of Leila, and she then suffers many injuries and then recovers to take her story forward and take her fight forward. I believe you have just finished your next novel, yeah? Could you tell us just a little about what it deals with and when it will be out?
I don't have a publishing contract yet, but it's called Silence Between the Notes. It's about the life of a musician, a Kurdish Yazidi musician in America, but it really touches upon the struggles of immigrants and refugees, the struggle to belong, to make a home for ourselves here. And yeah, she basically has lost her family and is walking down the streets one day and runs into a man that looks very much like her missing fiancé. But this man is married to an American woman and has a child. She wants to find out if that's actually him, her long-lost fiancé. But that means she also has to face the shadows from her past that she has been suppressing in an attempt to survive. Yeah, so unfortunately, the book is not available here for sale, which is very surprising. But the book is available everywhere. It's in paperback, hardback, audiobook. All the libraries have it, so I hope you consider picking up your own copy.
Yes, I got the book on September 24th because it is not available in India. And then I sat down to read it, and I was like almost 3/4 down the book. And it was so heartrending. I said, I'm not going to read this any further. And then I said, then what am I going to ask her about? I better get down and finish the job. And then it took on such a positive turn. So I request all of you to please go ahead and get this book. It will be one of the best decisions you've taken in your life, talking about a young woman and how she lives her dreams. Thank you. Yeah. So now I come to Shikha, the Great. Shikha Malviya's book of poems traces the life of Anandi Bai, whom she calls a Mona Lisa-esque figure, which is very interesting. This is an actual photograph of Anandi Bai Joshi. Supposedly the first Indian woman to travel alone from India to the USA in 1883 to study to become a doctor, which she did. So Shikha, from Yamuna to Anandi Bai, to Dr. Anandi Bai, it's a short journey in time, as Anandi barely lived 22 years. She died of tuberculosis. But it's a long one in growing up, in gathering the courage to go where no Hindu woman had gone before, to continue working hopefully at her medical studies when she was aware she was suffering from tuberculosis. As a poet, why did you take on this project, a biography written as a series of poems?
Thank you, Sandhya. So I came across Anandi Bai. I just want to give a brief explanation of how I came across her. So, when as an immigrant you come because your parents have moved here, and the narrative which you get is only like one generation before. So I wanted to know, because I felt it in my heart, that there had to be others who had come before us. And I wanted a sense of roots and history of being an immigrant. So I went and searched on the internet for the first Indian woman to come to the United States. And this amazing photograph popped up, a black and white photograph of 3 women doctors. And Anandi Bai was seated elegantly in a sari. And she had that Mona Lisa glance that no matter where you looked at the photograph from, her eyes followed you. And next to her was a Japanese doctor and then a Syrian doctor. And all of them were dressed in their native clothes. And they had all converged in Philadelphia in 1884 from their respective countries, because all of them were coming to study medicine. And they were all the first women to study medicine. So when I discovered that photograph, I was hooked. I was just entranced. I was like, who is this woman? I've never heard of her. Why haven't I heard of her? And I wanted to know more about her. So that's why I decided I want to write about her. But then I thought how to write about her. And as I did my research, I noticed that all the narratives I came across were from the lens of her husband being her savior. That it was her husband who educated her, that it was her husband who pushed her. And I felt her own agency was missing. Her own side of the story was missing, because when I came across her letters and I came across her writings, I saw what a confident, strong, and wise young woman she was, beyond her years and very progressive thinking. So as I read all of these narratives, and there were some that were written by women, but they were still, one was from a 19th century American feminist's gaze, or reformer as they called them at the time. And then one was from a 20th century scholar. But amongst all of that, I still felt, where is Anandibai's voice? So then I thought, I would like to try and write her story in her imagined voice. And through poetry, because her life was quite brief, I didn't want her story to get lost in, prose. I wanted to be impactful. I wanted it to be short almost, and I wanted it to be in such a way that everyone could grasp a bite of her life story. So that's why I decided to write it in poetry, and it was challenging. It was intimidating. I wasn't sure if I was the right person to write her story, whether I had the right to write her story, but she didn't let go of me. I started researching in 2017, and when the pandemic broke out, I could literally hear her saying, please, write my story, write my story. And so I gave in, and I would take her permission, literally, every day when I would start to write a poem, I'd say, Anandibai, what would you like me to write today?
Yeah, that you've written it very evocatively. She says, the pandemic broke out and raged. My life came to a standstill while Anandibai's came alive. That's very beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. It felt like living a whole other life despite being grounded. I think you use that time to also experiment with a number of formats in which the poems are presented. Well, I don't know how many of you are regular poetry readers, but most of us are used to, reading sonnets or reading rhymed verses or reading free words, etc. But this book is a challenge, believe me. It's a beautiful challenge. It's not a tough challenge. It's a challenge which invites you to come and partake of it every now and then and get to the answer of that challenge. So she has used numerous formats. In fact, she once describes her husband as a sickle or kind of sickle. Somebody who, his words, because sometimes her husband is very offensive to her. And so when she describes him, the poem actually takes the form of a sickle, which kind of cuts at the roots of growing plants or growing farmland, wheat or rice, the way she must have seen it in the fields around her home in Kalyan district near Pune. So though most are in standard free verse format, I've identified more than a dozen and find that they often correspond to the emotion portrait. Sometimes they come with quixotic tongue-in-cheek attitude, such as a mental photograph. Can you tell us more about that? The mental photograph?
Well, so Anandibai came to the United States in 1883, and there was, I guess you could call her a benefactress, but Anandibai referred to her as her aunt, or Maushi in Marathi. So this woman, Theodosia Carpenter, she was like a second mother to Anandibai, and Anandibai lived with her when she arrived. And in those days, and even nowadays sometimes, there's something like an autograph book, where you write your favorite color, your favorite, flower, your favorite, books, things like that. So I had this book that I read while I was researching, which had Anandibai's listing of all the things she loved. And in it, there were such fascinating, answers to things which gave you an insight as to how intelligent, how sharp, how aware she was of who she was, right? And there are some funny answers, there are some witty answers, but the thing that you mentioned at the beginning, right, about one of the questions was, if you could be anybody else in this world, who would you be? And this is a 19-year-old woman saying, no one, meaning she was so sure of who she was. So that just blew me away, and that's actually the quote at the beginning of the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. So I would like you to choose 2 or 3 poems that most strongly and most evocatively highlight the most significant points in Anandibai's life.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start off. So Anandibai was born as Yamuna. Ganpat Rao Joshi. And back in the day, when you were married, and she was married at the ripe old age of 9, because at that time she was considered too old, but her name was changed because it was symbolic of you are now part of a new family, so you get a new name. So her name was changed from Yamuna to Anandi, which means endless joy. So anyway, I'm going to read a poem which is called Naming, Namkaran, in which after a baby is born, there's a ceremony of their naming. Is it really true that being named after a river is bad luck, a turbulent life? Are all women rivers then? And tell me the story again of how I came to be a paisley in your belly, why you named me daughter of the blinding sun, sister of the Lord of death, tumbling down to earth to meet her blue beloved. How I was born the same day as a goddess riverine, whose holy drops the priest sprinkled on my forehead 11 days after my birth, introducing me to this world, whispering into my ear, Yamuna, 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 a contract signed in water, a girl's fate sealed. So the next poem I'm going to read is called Consumption. And so Anandi had a very difficult relationship with her husband because while he was encouraging and was considered a reformer and believed in women's education and girls' remarriage, he often used to beat her if she didn't study. So that's a big contradiction right there. And so that's why I wanted to represent the violence that was in her life, not only just through words, but also through the text. And because she died of tuberculosis, I wanted to foreshadow that. And so the poem is called Consumption, which can mean many different things, right?
Consumption was also the name for tuberculosis.
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah. Anyway, so consumption. His tongue is like a sickle. When the words come out, they cut me like a handful of grass, uprooting me from where I stand, dullard, lazy, incompetent. Adjectives he swings at me again and again. But if this were truly so, he wouldn't press me between jaws of books, the ink of alphabets seeping into my skin, staining my blood, this knowledge that consumes me as I consume it. He wouldn't hurl their hard spines at me if he thought I couldn't catch them. And should I just read one more? Or two more? Oh, two more? Okay.
I have some more.
Oh, okay, sure. So Anandi Bai, in 1883, she arrived in the United States and she was staying with her hosts, the Carpenters. And she brought several trunks which contained food and spices and different things. And she held a dinner for her hosts and their friends. This is in Roselle, New Jersey in 1883. So she drew like a grid on the floor as they did in back home. And yeah, she drew she drew a beautiful grid. And they didn't have banana leaves, but they had buttonwood tree leaves, and so she used that as plates. And she cooked a bunch of dishes, and she gave her saris out to all of her hostesses and friends, and they all dressed up like Indians, and she made them sit on the floor and eat with their hands in 1883, which is pretty amazing. It blew my mind when I read this. So I wrote a ghazal poem about this called When the Guests Sup as Gods. In my wildest dreams, never do I fathom tonight that I should turn them into feasting Indians tonight. Not those whose vast plains they call their own, but proud Marathas from my faraway native tonight. All the fair ladies draped in woven bordered saris, hands bangled, necks spangled, shining bright tonight, as they swish across the inlaid floor like princesses, in my colorful trousseau that belongs to them tonight. 18 squares hand-drawn in red and white powder, on the dining room floor where guests sup as gods tonight. Set with plates stitched from broad buttonwood leaves, a rich meal of spiced vegetables and fruit await all tonight. After a Sanskrit prayer blessing this feast is chanted, all eyes look up to me on how to proceed tonight. No spoons, no forks, nor knives, just their pale, bare hands, sampling 18 exotic dishes prepared by myself tonight. Well, oh, I'm not done, sorry. Yeah. Fashioning small balls out of their food with pink fingertips, they pop them into their mouths like all of India does tonight. The meal ends with a serenade and a sprinkling of rose water, bouquets of freshly plucked flowers given to each guest tonight. Oh, Anandi, see the red kunku on all their white foreheads. How the love of my new sisters makes this heart swell tonight.
You have one more? So I have one more. So yes. I'll tell you and then see if you can, see if you would like to read that. So Anandibai, when I was reading the poems, appears to have a very quirky sense of humor. Now, one doesn't know whether she really had it in real life or not, whether you've introduced it through the poems. But a poem like that, I'm sure your research has thrown up the fact that she did do this kind of a, pangat meal for those women. So I do believe that she had that quirky sense of humor, but which also emanates from her ability to be a keen observer and the take it in your stride attitude that most women naturally have. That's... So for example, Crazy Quilt Work is one poem which you have done. And she talks about quilting, which is supposed to be a national pastime and a cooperative effort of many women in a neighborhood, etc. And then they make these beautiful patterns with quilts. And then she compares it with the way in India we use every cloth till it completely become shreds, until last minute you end it, cleaning the floors, that sort of a thing. So she's wondering, what are these ladies doing quilting, and look at us using cloth in the most sustainable manner. But she actually saw that quilt, which I'm really amazed. She had made the quilt with the quilting women, and the quilt is in the museum in Pune, which museum? Raja Dinkar Kelkar Museum. She actually saw it. So I think that...
that was very moving. So this summer I was in India because this book came out in July with HarperCollins. And so I did a mini tour while I was in India. And when I went to Pune, first of all, I didn't know this because nowhere is it written anywhere that Anandibai, where she passed away, that house still exists. There's a small, tiny plaque in blue that says in Marathi or Hindi, Devanagari, that this is where Anandibai was born, though I believe she wasn't born there, and this is where she passed away. And it's in one of the busiest parts of the city, but I managed to find that. And then after that, like just 2 blocks away is this museum, Rajaji Dinkar Kelkar Museum. And this quilt is still preserved, and it is a sight to behold because even though it's partly in shreds, Anandibai, while she was in the United States, her American friends that she met, the women, they all gifted her scraps of fabric. And so she, while she was doing medical studies, she needed to unwind as well. So she discovered this thing, which they, at the time, patchwork quilting, they called crazy quilting because it was with a bunch of different, scraps of fabric. So, this was her way to connect with American culture. This was also her way where she really felt she was able to, participate in something. So when I saw that quilt, like she had different things embroidered on it. So I got to see her handwriting, and in one patch she's written September, in another she's written her husband's name in Devanagari, Gopal Rao. And it was just a sight to behold that after 150 years, there was something which her fingers touched over and over again that is still out there and still on display. So I will read this poem, Crazy Quilt Work, for you. Yeah. Resourcefulness knows no nationality among women tending the hearth. We are mistresses of improvisation, magicians of the ordinary. Those fabric scraps whose warp and weft seem exhausted, we collect like leaves till they are plenty, a motley come together haphazardly. No symmetry, no intentional design, just hard-working fingers patching together what seems out of order. This crazy work, an American pastime, becomes this Maratha woman's way to pass a summer filled with anticipation and premonition. So much to be done, so little time to do it. These gifted blocks of cloth, beading bright with love and generosity, become a quilt that covers my unseasoned chills, my malaise for which no cure fits.
Thank you. Thank you. So coming back to you, Ava, one of the things I do back in India is to volunteer at an organization which is working with the indigenous or tribal communities, as well as the denotified and nomadic communities, popularly known as the DNTs. Now, while none of these communities are in a great socio-economic situation, the recognized tribal communities mostly own some land and are at least protected under the reservation label of ST, which is Scheduled Tribe. The DNTs, on the other hand, have no such protection. They are also labeled criminal tribes, as they were notified thus under the British in 1871. Though denotified in 1952, after India became free, they are still treated as thieves by the police and generally socially shunned. Their condition is very similar to the Kurds, I find, treated as outsiders in their own homeland. We were introduced to the DNTs by the Gnanpith awardee Bengali writer Mahashweta Devi, who worked tirelessly to protect them from being picked up randomly by the police for a thrashing, possibly death in custody. She loved coming to our Adivasi Academy. We set up in a village about 90 kilometers from Baroda, where I live, which is a largely tribal populated region. And she wanted to be buried at the Adivasi Academy after she passed. Unfortunately, in the last few years, she suffered from Alzheimer's. And so she didn't remember any of us with whom she worked quite closely. But fortunately, after her death, her family allowed us to bury her ashes at the academy. On the epitaph is carved her most beautiful words: "Every dream has a right to live." I find that thought resonates rather poignantly with a line in Ava's book, where Chia Saman, Leila's activist brother, tells her, "Dreams matter, Leila Gia." Is that right? Yeah. Dreams matter, Leila Gia. Desires matter. Take them seriously. So when we talk of triumph of a woman, and we are confronted with characters such as Leila, Sheila, and Joanna from Ava's book, and Shika's Anandibai, we understand and appreciate how they fought hard to achieve their dreams. And we hope that their stories encourage those on the sidelines to drive their destiny towards their dreams too. So thank you, Ava and Shika. It was lovely chatting with you. And thank you, audience, for choosing to hear what we had to say. And thank you, Sala, for this wonderful opportunity for bringing us all together. So thank you and God bless. We have 10 minutes for questions, if any.
Thank you for sharing that piece. It's true that a lot of indigenous people across the world are dehumanized, and that's in an attempt to claim the land that's rightfully theirs. And so in that attempt of dehumanizing, the approaches that are used are different. I was so sad to hear that this group are treated as thieves. Kurds are known as honest people, and we are not put in jail for these kind of crimes. We are a majority among political prisoners. What that means is that when a group of women get together and try to do something, the government sees that as subversive and tries to intimidate us. And it's very telling that even though we make about 12 to 15% of Iranian population, there is one place when we are always the majority, and that's among political prisoners. So it's political suppression, but there is a sense of respect for our dignity and for our resistance. And usually the suppression comes from the government, not from other people. Yeah, it doesn't come from Persians or other ethnic groups. It's mostly a governmental thing in an attempt to steal from you, right? Steal your resources, and they need to dehumanize you, otherwise, they wouldn't be able to continue their crimes. Yeah. Are there any questions?
Any questions? Yes?
I was fascinated by your description of the young woman getting married at the time.
Yes.
Could you just speak to whether that was normal at the time? And was her parents' involvement?
Yes, so actually I have a poem about that happening. So Anandi by her family, well, first of all, she was a middle child, and she was sort of an unwanted child when she was born. I think she had two elder sisters, and then I believe a son was born, and then she was born, and they wanted more sons. So. And she had smallpox, and her skin was pitted, and she was on the darker side, and she was actually on the chubbier side. So her parents were worried that nobody would want to marry her and that she was like a tomboy, because she played with her brothers and she wrestled with them. She wasn't as ladylike as they would have liked her to have been. And so she came from a very privileged family, but they'd fallen on hard times, so they weren't rich either. And so they were very worried about getting her married. And so they tried to find a suitable match for her when she was 8. And they found someone who was 16 years older than her. And believe it or not, the day they were to get married, her husband had run away. He didn't show up for the wedding because he was a reformer, and he wanted to find a widow to remarry. I mean, he believed in widow remarriage. And so he looked for a widow and couldn't find one. So Anandi Bai was the consolation prize. He came back, and I think a few weeks later, which happened to be her birthday, he ended up marrying her. So that's how she got married. And she had no choice whatsoever in the matter at all. At that time, marriages were all arranged. Yeah.
But the girl didn't go to the husband's house after marriage until she attained her menses.
Yeah, usually they would wait for the girl to get her period or to attain puberty before going to her in-laws' place. But actually, in the case of Anandi Bai, there's also some debate about that as well, if you read her biography. So she went through a lot. And, I've tried to put all of that in this book through poetry. There is a poem about when she gets her period, and it's celebrated, because at that time, it was tradition to celebrate that, because, they're celebrating the wealth of the womb, because then she will bring forth a son. And ultimately, what happens is she becomes pregnant at around, now again it's debatable, 12 or 14, but she becomes pregnant, she gives birth to a boy, and then he dies 10 days after. And that's what informs her decision to become a medical doctor, because at that time, women were too shy to approach medical doctors who were all men and were mostly European. So the loss of her son is what propelled her to want to become a doctor. And it had nothing to do with her husband telling her, you should become a doctor. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there are several that I trust, but off the top of my head, Kurdish Red Crescent is a very reliable source, especially since the earthquake hit the Kurdish region back a couple years ago, and Syrian and Turkish government puts a lot of obstacles for Western aid workers to reach people who actually need help. They were able to overcome those obstacles because they're from the region. They're working tirelessly. Yeah, Kurdish Red Crescent, they're based in the UK. Thanks. Someone over there, I had a question. Yeah. That's a really good question, a complex question. It's a very paradoxical in nature kind of relationship with women. You know how she was mentioning that on one hand they marry you off, on the other hand they celebrate your menstruation? So you see this kind of irony as well when you are celebrated but only as part of a larger group, either your family or part of the government. And in terms of where statelessness combines with misogyny, then it becomes an extremely difficult force to battle, right? You're battling poverty, you're battling wars, you're battling male chauvinism, you're battling ethnic chauvinism, right? And that's why when you look at Kurdish women, you see such a contrasting images. You know, on one hand, you see when ISIS attacked the Kurdish area, who did they take as sex slaves? Kurdish women. Who fought ISIS and liberated other women, other Kurdish women, right? So there is this extreme strength that it's like superpower that they have, and there's this extreme oppression, and that's when statelessness comes on top of every other thing that you're dealing with. Even in academia, where you're supposed to exist, you look at like Near Eastern studies, Middle Eastern studies, Kurdish women are lost everywhere. There's Persian studies, there's Arab studies, Kurdish women aren't necessarily studied. You go to the famous museum in New York where they have artifacts from all over the world. There is like Turkish artifacts, Persian artifacts. Some of those artists were Kurdish, but we can't know, right? We don't have statistics in the United States today to understand how many Kurds live in diaspora because their passports say they're Turkish or they're Iranian, right? So there's so many layers that gender reality are combined with statelessness. Yeah.
Somebody from here wanted to ask.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, how much research did you have to do on antibody and how difficult was it to get the actual facts for you to write for?
So, you know, it wasn't the type of difficult that is bad. It was, so I love doing research. So in a way, it's sort of like excavation. And so I did look at different archives. I searched on the internet. And so I found, so I actually detail all of this in the beginning essay, and then I have a bibliography in the back as well. But there were two primary texts that I used. One was freely available on the internet and was written by a woman called Caroline Healy Dahl. And she was a Western feminist who had met, feminist reformer, who had met Anandibai several times when Anandibai was in the United States. And as soon as Anandibai passed away, she contacted her husband and all those who were close to her in the United States and collected her letters, collected anecdotes. And so she wrote that book within 1 year of her passing. So a lot of the things, especially when she quotes Anandibai, I took to be very close to the truth because they were written so closely after her death. And that was available on the internet freely to download. I was so shocked, but I mean, the joyful shock of, yay, I've discovered something. And then Drexel University, which was formerly the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, they had quite a few things in their archive, like they had her scanned letters of when she applied for admission, they had pictures of her as well, and they had some different documents as well, like there was the invitation to her graduation. So all of these things, you're sort of panning for gold. But at the same time, every time you discover one more thing, it was like, it was like a puzzle I was putting together. So I did do research, I want to say on and off, but I did it for a good 4 or 5 years because even though you take that research, you're mining that research, you also need to let that settle down in your mind, right? You need to ruminate, you need to think about it. But yeah, then there were a couple of other books that I read, and there were some books in Marathi, but because I am not fluent in Marathi, although I can read Devanagari, it was a little difficult for me. I even did see a play, a series, and a movie on her as well. So I looked at a lot of different mediums, and then there were some scholarly articles on her that had been written, and then there was this book by this 20th century Marathi scholar, which was written in English, and those were also based on her letters and translations, as well as Caroline Healy Doll's book. So it was interesting to see that other people also had the same sources. But then at the end of the day, you have to take all of that, and when you're translating somebody else's life and putting yourself in their shoes, you have to take the essence of that. So it is challenging to, like, there was a lot I left out as well. But I wanted to focus the story on her and let it be from her point of view. So that's why you won't see as much as other characters that were in her life. This is just in her imagined eyes, yeah.
So there's no time now, I'm sorry. Okay, let's have one question from you.
Difficult. Hi, Monica, nice to meet you, and thanks for that very complex question. So in terms of fiction, you deliberately make an effort to divorce yourself from the story, because you do have these urges, right? Let me put in some of what I experienced in the middle of it. But if you listen to those urges, it might take away from your goal, and your goal is to write a good story, right? So maybe you do allow some of you to come in, but then in the process of editing, you take away whatever is not organic to the story. I think it's in that sense for me, because I also write essays and write poetry, it's a completely different process than fiction. Yeah. On the other hand, they are the products of your consciousness. And every research that you do expands your consciousness. So even when you look at your most despicable characters, you're in them, right?
So I want to share, there's this wonderful poet I love who, he writes about history through poetry, especially about the Black community. His name is Tayimba Jess, and his book Olio had won the Pulitzer Prize. So he said in this talk of his that I listened to, is that when you're writing about yourself, when you're writing about someone else, you're also writing to learn something about yourself. Right? And so I truly believe that. And in the case of Anandibai Joshi, I resonated with so many of the situations she was in. Like, she was torn between tradition and modernity, between trying to please everybody around her, but also trying to follow what she wanted to do. And I really struggled with that as I was growing up as well. And then also about, agency and what does that mean? A lot of different things, right? And so subconsciously, we are drawn to a certain narrative, a certain story of wanting to write something because it says something about who we are or who we want to, be. So I think that, it's not about me, but it is part of me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
triumphant women. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for attending our panel. So the books, at least this book is available here. Her book is available everywhere. So please go and buy it.